All right, well, welcome to Electromagnetic Animism, more of a performance piece with some discourse woven through. And before we begin, Mark Pilkington is going to explain what's the name of your device? Misty. How Misty is approaching the evening.
Okay, everyone. Yeah, Erik's going to be reading. I'll just introduce Misty, my synthesizer companion. And actually, what we've devised for tonight is relevant to tonight's discussion, in that, as I often like to do, I'm using a number of semi-random or quasi-random voltages from specially designed synthesizer components to kind of allow Misty to express itself and express its own inner patterns, flows, and connections. And it's going to be playing around with Erik's voice we recorded a bit earlier, and also some other tones and drums and things. So the idea is that, yeah, I'm not really playing Misty in a conventional sense. I'm kind of working with it and guiding it. And people did ask, Misty is modular instrumentation for space-time yantra, just in case you wondered.
Of physics tell us there are four fundamental forces in the universe, minted in the reverberating flash of the Big Bang: gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. These forces are actually better named fundamental interactions, relationships, for it is in relationships that are most animated. Gravity, the weakest force, is most apparent on the grandest of scales, the large-scale structure of galaxies, nebulae, and planets. The strong and weak nuclear forces rule the microscopic world of particles, the initial crystals of the quantum sea. But our world, the world of standing stones and killer drones, of lightning and rainbows, and that radio broadcast of Hitler's 1927 Nuremberg rally, which even now is radiating into deep space, hundreds of thousands of miles from the planet, is ruled by electromagnetism. The combination of electrostatic, electric, and magnetic interactions. Electromagnetism absolutely determines the macroscopic scale of the things that we deal with, the chemical bonds. They make our world stick together, lending matter its density and its dance, its life, or if you prefer, its soul. And our souls as well, since we run deeply on electromagnetic signals from our nervous system to all the chemical interactions that drive our metabolism. And there's no reason, as New Age physicists often like to do, to dig down to quantum physics to get to weirdness. Quantum physics is weird, but electromagnetism, it'll do. Let's take this situation right here. So this machine is plugged into a vast internet of energy that is fluctuating back and forth at the speed of light 50 times a second. That's pretty weird. But what's weirder is that what exactly is moving at the speed of light? It's not the electrons themselves that make up the copper wire that largely composes the electrical grid, but instead these entities are, what they say, communicating their force. So just as the molecules in a wave can be moving more slowly than the waves themselves, these relatively slow-moving electrons are communicating a pattern of force, of charge, back and forth at the speed of light. That's pretty weird. Another one is that since MISTY is plugged into this grid, like all things plugged into the grid, it's generating its own electromagnetic field. And technically speaking, this electromagnetic field is tweaking particles in the most distant nebulae of the cosmos. So again, there's really no need to dig down to the quantum level to discover the weirdness that lurks in our fundamentally electromagnetic plane of reality. So no wonder that images and the language of the numinous have surrounded electromagnetism from the get-go. Magnetism, of course, is the hypnotic yin to electricity's yang, a dark moon tug rather than a jolt of solar fire. And its attractive magic has been associated with animist powers for millennia. To ward off the diseases of demons, the Sumerians inscribed healing sigils on magnets, amulets dedicated to martyrdom. He who causes action at a distance, for that is what these things seem to do. Many of the earliest Western books on electricity describe the force in explicitly alchemical terms. The ethereal fire, the quintessential fire, the desideratum, the final outcome of the alchemical process. Animist and organic language hovers about the science of the stuff, which people interacted with far before people understood or built models that explained what electricity was. So people were very good at messing around with current when they had no idea about what came to be the scientific language of fields and forces. So we talk about a wave of electricity, a current running down a wire, fields of forces. At first, when this language was minted by Michael Faraday, he thought these were just sort of useful fictions to explain this bizarre phenomenon of electricity, electromagnetism. But he came to discover and to think about them as a fundamental description of the nature of reality. And indeed, at the end of the 19th century, the model of the world that is produced by thinking about electromagnetism utterly dissolves the extremely materialistic view of scientists of the day who thought in terms of little atoms of matter that were building blocks of the universe. Instead, electromagnetism dissolves this coarse materialism into a universe, an enormous vibrating mantra of potent nothings. The analogy, the analog, became the real. Fields, forces, waves, vibrations. What a wonder. Do we really even know what electricity is? Asked Lama Govinda. By knowing the laws according to which it acts, and by making use of them, which is what we do, we still do not know the origin or the real nature of this force, which ultimately may be the very source of life, light, and consciousness itself, the divine power and mover of all that exists. That's the worldview we see reflected in the paintings of Pablo Amaringo behind us, this world of divine power and vibration. Electricity was, for Lama Govinda anyway, an old mode of understanding the world, the animist mode, which only expressed what the poets of all times have felt. That nature is not a dead mechanism, but vibrant with life, with the same life that becomes vocal in our thoughts and emotions. So perhaps another origin story than the Big Bang, the one you all know about, or maybe a little twist on this tale, because the book of Genesis tells us that on the first day of creation, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But if you read closely, it wasn't until a few days later that God created the the moon and the sun and all the stars. So what was this first light? And where did it go when the moon and the stars and the sun came around? Well, some electromagnetic theosophists, some animists of natural history, thought that what this first light was the electrical fire. Was this hidden, informing, electromagnetic force that created and informed things from within. That instead of looking at dead matter as something controlled by a god from outside who brings breath into it, that the matter itself was already ensouled, already charged with life. Is electromagnetism or electricity one of these other than human persons? Hard to say. Hard to say. Thinking as an animist, one is perhaps better to consider it a sort of source of persons, or a multiplicity of possible persons. The lightning person, the circuit person. It does seem to be a jinn of sorts, or a host of jinn. Many now made to do our bidding, and yet, in being made to do our bidding, these jinns seem to have wormed themselves into every fabric and zone in our experiential lives. This is a vibrating army that forms the platform upon which the information society rests. Because while we think in terms of information, of data flow, of digits, this entire world all rests and runs on the power, perhaps controlled, perhaps less controlled than we would like, of electromagnetism. This shift from electromagnetism as a force, as an energy, as a power, into information happens in the middle of the 19th century. When Samuel Morse goes, hey, if we have a current running through a wire at more or less the speed of light, and we interrupt that current at one end, the current will be interrupted at the other end as well. And if we create a code of the pattern of those interruptions, we can transform this force, this energy, this bizarre, very quick force of the earth into information. And so, though the telegraph holds a rather humble position in our own bestiary of technologies, it really did inspire and spark the information age. And what did you see when the telegraph occurred? Suddenly news moves much more quickly. Suddenly markets around the world start to grow in sync. Suddenly it's much easier to run an imperialist, colonialist empire like Britain had in the 19th century. Suddenly time itself becomes coordinated, because now you have to link all of these different sites. And so it's only in the 19th century that organized time zones come into existence. This really is the beginning of the information age. The first message that ran on Samuel Morse's telegraph wire was, "What hath God wrought?" And we might say that what God, or at least Morse's telegraph wrought, was the information age. Was it really God who wrought this? It seems more like it's those old pesky jinn of electromagnetism who wrought this. But what would it mean? Again, trying desperately at the edge of poetry and ridiculousness to think like an animist. What would it mean to encounter, to genuinely encounter the persons that are in the electrical world, the persons that hum the electromagnetic spectrum? As Robert mentioned, it's not as if all stones are equally animated, or that all landscapes are equally animated. You can see that in indigenous frameworks of mind, certain sites, a hilltop, a confluence of rivers, a particular stone, these stand out. These are places where energies gather and become more available for encounter. There's a wonderful story that anthropologist Robert mentioned when he was researching the Ojibwe. He asked an old man, "Are all the stones alive?" And the man says, "No, but some of them are." So where are the living spirits of electricity, of electromagnetism? What vibrations are alive? "I am electrical by nature," said Beethoven. "Music is the electric soil in which the spirit lives, thinks, and invents." Earlier, in responding to the images Robert showed of the axis, we noted that there's a relationship between the non-utilitarian aspect of objects and their animist, or at least artistic potential. Meaning that there are many it things, many it objects that we use to get ahead of the world. They're transparent to our own desires. Their character as agents is perhaps relatively small. But when those objects are worked with excessive attention to aesthetic effect, with notable care, or with a certain wildness, a certain playfulness, outside the realm of utility, outside the realm of ordinary use, then something more lively happens. So one of the things that happens when we turn to electromagnetic devices to make sound and music is we're leaving the realm where we enslave electricity for utility alone. Instead, it's allowed to play. It's allowed to move and dance. In some sense, talk back. Electricity enlivens and enchants music not only by adding volume and dimension, but by giving musical signals another order of presence. In other words, a life of their own. All recorded and amplified sound is electronic, but the divide between analog and digital sound production and processing is itself a kind of poem about the electromagnetic world of animist experience. What do I mean by this? The somewhat tiresome division between the analog and the digital nonetheless contains within it a profound way of thinking through these issues as they relate to electromagnetism and as they relate to our fundamental models of reality. This, of course, depends a little bit on your age. I was born in an era dominated by analog media, and so I've seen steadily my investments in analog media be challenged and undermined by the onslaught of the digital. Younger people see analog media in a more quaint fashion, or are quick to recognize that every feature of analog media that you might care for can, of course, be simulated with a computer. An interesting question. Is there a difference? Is there a difference? It's kind of an old and hoary one, especially among music buffs, and I don't want to reiterate excessively some of these questions, but it's interesting to note that the qualities that are ascribed to the analog, warmth, presence, life, are in some sense animist qualities, so that we can see even in this industrial technology, this 20th century world of recording and producing sound using electromagnetic devices, even in that we can see an industrial trace of an old animist spirit. So let's think about this difference. The analog, and of course, MISTY, is an entirely analog device. The term analog, well, comes from analogy. This is like that. The basic metaphor, the basic move of the poem. So the undulating grooves of a vinyl LP are like, or mimic, the undulations of this very light juice we call the air, striking your eardrum through this fluid medium that makes it impossible to hear, of course, in space. Digital comes from digit, an abstract numerical representation of a single slice of flowing sound, sampled at such a high rate that it tricks us into recognizing it as a flow. Pretty clever. Analog resonates, digital simulates. Analog hugs more tightly to the ways of the earth, with its flows and inevitable physical decay. The Xerox of the Xerox of the Xerox is a process of fading that we can see a reflection, in some sense, of our own bodies as our DNA repeats itself, but somehow over the years doesn't quite cut the mustard anymore. And we begin to see in our bodies the traces of the oncoming of our own death. There's a mirror here in the analog. The analog life is an animist life, or the nostalgic trace of an animist life. And what analog is like is the wave, the undulating continuities that everywhere weave the natural world, from the rolling seas to the rolling hills to the petals of the rose. These are metaphors, but they are animistic and pagan metaphors. Because inside the magic circle of the occult, if you follow that crack in conventional ontology, you will find a world where metaphors, too, take on a life of their own. They're not just icing on the poetic cake. Metaphors, analogies, are forms of experience, of existential and imaginal opportunity and encounter. Of course, we only really recognize the analog in the rearview mirror as we accelerate ever faster into the post-human digital future of data glut, surveillance, and the sort of twitchy, brain-linking multitasking that drives the promise and pathologies of networked life. Now the analog is such an object of nostalgia, sort of hipster consumerism, the return of a sort of embodied life, but in this sort of framed, easy to consume, sort of groovy way, whether it's the fetishizing of vinyl LPs, or to some degree of analog synthesizers, or canning your own food, or local. We see this urge, this drive, this desire for a more animist relationship mimicked and modulated through the market. And this raises a profound question that I was talking with someone about at the break, which is that for all the appeal of the animist frame of mind in its traditional indigenous context, where it fundamentally supports and engages deeply integrated experience of human culture in relationship to the specific beings and flows and processes that we brutally call nature, as if it's out there and we're just in here. That animism and animistic thinking has a different vector or possibility or potential in our own world, which is precisely the magic of the commodity. Marx wasn't kidding around when he talked about commodity fetishism. And even if his idea of the fetish was itself a sort of misunderstood use of a very crude anthropological term, he nonetheless got something right about the magic of the market. And so part of the difficulty, part of the conundrum that I think we find ourselves in is we recognize and hear the call of the animist life, of the analog world where our bodies live and drink and fuck and die and dream. But at the same time, that enchantment, that sense of connection with objects around us is deployed, vampirized, expressed, perhaps, in this crazy world of hyper-technological development and the deep imbrication of the very fabric of our beings into electromagnetic networks of information flow. This is a conundrum. I have no answers. I think, like many of you, only have hints. But I think that it is these hints, these winks that we get from the world, these cracks, again, in our ordinary ontologies, where we see glimmers of some other mode of being that allows us to elude both the traps of a false ensorcelment with the objects of distraction and destruction, and yet a genuine engagement, not just with natural objects, but even with those machines with which we'd love to dance and dream. Thank you, Misty.